Hi there, and thank you for joining us on the Overcomers Overcoming podcast. We feature those who are in the process of overcoming or have overcome any type of life encounter, life obstacle that at the time seemed to be almost insurmountable. With this podcast, we have three objectives in mind. Our first objective is we want you to know with a confident resolve you are not alone. We want to work with you. We want you to know there are others who are working with you, who want to help you through whatever you are encountering, and together we will get through whatever you're experiencing.
Our second objective is there are multiple options for any life encounter you are facing. We want to help you develop a resolve that there are various options and solutions to any life dilemma.
Our third objective is to help you with critical thinking skills. If you're encountering something that was possibly a decision you made sometime in the past, and if you had the opportunity for a life redo, you would make a different decision. We want to help you with those critical thinking skills that can help you make an informed decision and not encounter what you're going through at the moment. We are the Cooper Culture, a veteran-owned business. We work with business personnel and families to develop and sustain connected relationship cultures within their families and organizations. That type organization is one where people feel wanted, appreciated, and genuinely a part of that organization. I'm with my wife and business partner, Marty, who is helping me facilitate this podcast. Today we feature Mary Barlow, who discusses her early life of her mother terminating her life early. She was 7 years old when this happened. It was a traumatic end to her mother's life. It was a part of their family culture that you just don't discuss these type things. So Mary went through nearly 40 years of her life to process what happened to her mother, and as she calls it, reframing her mind to eventually start a new life. She wrote a book, Home, and the restoration of how she made it through this. But Marty, it's a very difficult story, but Mary is on the good side of it now, being able to discuss some of the lessons learned. What are some things our listeners can gain from Mary's story?
Mary talked about the fact that back then when she was 7, families just moved on. They didn't talk about it. She says sometimes people say children are resilient, but she said that's not true. They just move on. They roll with life. And back then no one would talk to a child about what they were going through. But in her book, she has suggestions of words or questions that you could ask a child, or you could ask someone going through a traumatic time.
It's a great opportunity to learn from the person who experienced this life trauma and is still going through a journey of learning. Let's listen and learn together. Mary, it's great to have you with us. Our listeners are going to be very interested in learning about how you have overcome a life trauma. My understanding is your mother committed suicide at your early age, and that may be traumatic just thinking about that. There's some of our listeners who would say, well, I don't want to bring up the past and maybe create bad memories or anything of that nature. There may be some of our listeners who say, I don't know how to engage the Marys of the world, therefore I'll just kind of walk by and not say anything. Mary, I think you have a great life story. You have written a book. Our listeners are going to be very interested in knowing, but we're all interested in learning about your life experience, the journey you are on, and how we can all be a benefit to others. Mary, it's great to have you with us.
Thank you so much, Ron and Marty. It's wonderful to be here.
Mary, can you give our listeners kind of a top-level view of your mom and what happened at an early age? And let's just take it from there. How did you recover from that?
Yeah. I want to start with something you said, though, Ron. You said, some people may not know how to approach people who've experienced trauma in their lives. What to say, do I just shy away from that topic? And maybe they wonder, well, what is this person like, after going through something like that? And the truth is, people don't have to skirt around it, I don't think. My mother passed away when I was 7 years old, and she took her own life. I found out when I was 11 years old how she died. I knew she died when I was 7, but I just didn't know the how part of it. Funny enough, I never asked how my mother died. I just didn't ask that question. I think I was in too much shock, and it honestly never occurred to me to ask. I have 2 boys of my own now who I brought up, and when they were 7 years old, they were loaded with questions, and they seemed to want to know every angle of every single thing. And so that's when I sort of questioned my own behavior at that year. I thought, how could I have not asked that question? But maybe it was a way of self-protecting. And how I grew up with that, not without a mom, was I really just rolled with it. It was very hard, and it was much more turbulent than as a child I understood, because as children, we do roll with it. I think a lot of people say that children are resilient. I don't believe that's true. I think children feel everything. I think children are taking in, processing all of the things that occur to them in their own way. Trauma at a young age is very, very disruptive, but they just don't show it. So growing up, I don't think I showed it very much.
Is there a point in your life, Mary, and what we're trying to do is project you from your life to others? Can we approach the topic too soon? That is, ask too many questions too soon? And if yes to that, how can we discern, well, not yet, maybe not now or ever? And some people don't even want to approach that, so therefore they'll just walk past you without saying anything.
Yeah, it's so true, Ron. I think how you know whether or not it's too sensitive to approach with a person is when you just start checking in with them on it, or maybe having some conversations around it. What is their reaction, right? If they get upset when they talk about an event, and I'm only talking from my own experience, okay? But if they get upset when they're talking about it, physically upset, they may have not fully processed that event, right? And so that would be an indicator to go carefully. I don't think it's an indicator to stop talking, though, because I think I think that's part of processing it, is to be able to talk about it. And if you're close enough to somebody to be able to say, gee, have you talked to anybody about this? Have you ever received professional help? For someone my age, it's pretty common, as if they had trauma as a child, to have never received professional help. And I'll admit, I hate to admit my age, but I am 63. So it is very common for someone in that age range, like a baby boomer, to have not received professional help as a child because it was shunned away. At least in my case, for my family, it was shameful to seek psychiatric help. It was something we don't do. So after my mother passed away, my family wanted to just move on as if this didn't happen and just try to, get along the best we could. But we didn't really talk about my mother that much, and especially what happened. That just wasn't a topic of conversation. So it's possible that someone could be walking around with a trauma that they haven't fully processed because they didn't have the tools to do so as a child.
I clearly understand, and I want our listeners to understand that every person is an individual. Your experience may necessarily be different from some others, and we understand that. But I think what you're saying, Mary, and please correct me if I'm not processing this correctly, engage a person in conversation and adapt as you are listening to, watching the facial expressions and so forth. It may be too soon, too raw an experience at this moment, but at least be willing to engage that person in conversation. Am I processing what you're saying correctly?
Yeah, I do. I believe that's correct. I really do. And, at the end of the day, a person may not want to engage on a particular topic. They may just choose, and they're going to be very quiet about it, I believe. But I don't think there's harm in trying. I really don't.
Now, for you, some time has passed since your mom took her life. And I'm supposing the experience is not as raw and bitter now as it has been,
Mhm.
but are there flashbacks? Are there times
Oh,
when
yeah.
it's very difficult to even discuss this topic?
Yeah. So let me just rewind a slight bit and just explain like a little bit about how I unpack this, okay, over my lifetime. So I went through a period of time when I couldn't talk about what happened in my family. And if I tried to do so, I would cry. I would be just, it would be impossible to have a conversation with me. And that occurred for about 40 years after my mother took her life. It took me a long time to be able to just really talk about it without getting upset. But over the years, especially by having children of my own, I was able to reframe what happened and have a better understanding of it and be able to really place for myself why my mother did such a thing, right? As a 7-year-old child, you have zero insight. But as you sort of gain insight into thinking about your parents, which I know we all do, and asking questions of her siblings and my older siblings, I believe my mother had postpartum depression after having my brother Donald, who has Down syndrome, and he's been a joy in our lives. He was born with Down syndrome, and my mom already had 5 children. That, there are factors that you can read about as to why a person may develop postpartum depression, and my mother checked all the boxes for that. So I believe that's what happened. Through me being able to reframe that through my adult mind helped me to heal a lot from that.
Our listeners are very interested in your expression of reframing your mind. It was a mindset change. That's how I'm interpreting what you're saying. It took you about 40 years to get over the emotions of this. In hindsight, could that 40-year period have been reduced a little bit had you sought professional help, or had anybody else of caring, I'm going to use that term, engaged in your life? Could that have helped any?
Absolutely. I think professional help would have been a good thing. I did have a lot of people around me who loved me and cared about me, an older sister, some older brothers, wonderful aunts and uncles. My dad, who wasn't really a family guy, but I mean, I know that he meant well in many of the things that he did. So I did have that, but we weren't talking about this. It wasn't helping me to process what was happening, with the loss of my mother. So I definitely think it would have helped. And then your question was, are there triggers now? Are there triggers now, that bother me? Yes, there absolutely are little triggers every day, little ones. So they're not enough to completely upset the apple cart, but there might be something that I see that makes me kind of shudder a little bit. And I have to just understand that, we're going to move on, and that, just kind of, I can move on from that and I'll be okay.
Now, for the listener who is listening to what you just said, we
Mhm.
could very innocently trigger a thought through conversation. It may be just an innocent thought on our part, and it triggers a thought for you. Can we help you over that? Would we recognize what I'm trying to do, Mary, is think for the listener who is engaging you in conversation, and by golly, only you would know the moment at which I triggered a thought. But if we did trigger a thought, can we recognize that and maybe change the direction of the conversation to help? I'm not even sure I'm wording this correctly.
No, you are. And let me explain. Some of these triggers are visual, and I'll give you an example in a minute. but some of them do come up in conversation. And I would say, I don't feel like it's anybody's responsibility because I'm not that fragile anymore. So I wouldn't even say it. If a friend to me started talking about her childhood and all the wonderful things she did with her mom, and I thought, shoot, I can't relate to that. I don't have that. And it might trigger a little something, but I will never say anything about me in that way in that moment. I will probably engage my friend in asking her questions about what she did. Oh, it must have been wonderful to do that train ride with your mom to New York City. I wouldn't, say, oh, I didn't have a mother to do that with. Now, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, I might have brought that and made it about myself. I think it was part of that processing, but I no longer do that. I don't want people to feel uncomfortable. And I think I'm strong enough now that I can stand on my two. The other one, I'm going to be very, very honest, and this may trigger something for somebody else because I'm going to say something very, very sensitive here. My mother died by hanging herself. When I was 7 years old or 11 years old, and I learned about that, I was so completely shocked because I just, I hadn't really thought too much about a person doing that to themselves. So it was a major shock. But still, I didn't see my mother in that state. Okay. I didn't find her. And maybe it's a good thing I didn't dwell on that. What was that actually like to do such a thing? But when I was later in my life, watched a movie, movies are very dramatic. Somebody was hung, okay, as a punishment. And then I saw that, well, that triggered something major because I thought, wow, that's what my mother did. Okay. On Halloween, if I'm walking down the street and a lot of people will hang things from trees like skeletons, and I have to get away from that. I just don't want to see it. So little things like that. If I see something hanging above me that looks human, I have to, kind of move away from that. It triggers it, but it's not so bad that I'm going to break down and cry and it ruins my day. It reminds me, of something that was very hurtful in my life.
I think aligned with what you just said, Mary, but I wonder if you can talk to us a little bit more about reframing your mind, unpack that a little bit more. What I'm taking from what you said about reframing your mind is that you are able to maybe process communication, process thoughts more positively at some point in your life than earlier in your life. Am I discerning that correctly?
Yeah, absolutely. I think because a lot of what happened, I've come to understand and put it in a place where it can make as much sense as it can for me at this point in time. I mean, and a lot of people who have experienced trauma as a youngster will say, well, you never really get over it completely. It never completely goes away, but you're able to go on with your life in a super positive way. You don't necessarily have to wallow in it and feel those triggers. In terms of the reframing, I can see something like that, let's say at Halloween time. And the reframing is that I see it. I know, for me, it brings something unpleasant to mind, but then 2 seconds later, I'm over it. I'm not continuing to dwell on it. My mind isn't spinning on it. It doesn't go back in memory all about what happened to my mother. I don't spend a lot of time on that. I'm able to just move on. I feel like I've done that already. The reframing too is, when I think about, I'll be again, another honest and very sensitive thing. Okay. When I was 7 years old, and I walked into the kitchen one morning and I said, oh, Ma, I'm sorry, I wet my bed again. That morning, she committed suicide. So when I was 11 years old, and I learned, and I put 2 and 2 together when I learned how my mother died, that she took her own life and so forth. And I thought back to that morning, it came with this news of how she died came with a tremendous amount of guilt, because I thought, oh my God, I made her do that, because right after I told her, she slammed her cookbook shut. She said, I'm sick and tired of this. And I thought, oh, so it took many years later when I was in my 30, when I was 30, I had my first child and I had my second boy when I was 33 years old. If you have kids, I should have asked you that question, Ron and Marty, but my kids, they have wet their beds. They have, spilled stuff on the floor and danced on it. They have slung mud, broken windows. They've even had some real carousing during their college years. And there is nothing that they ever did that made me want to take my life. I mean, there's nothing they could do to make me want to leave the planet. I love them so infinitely, and I just couldn't imagine not being around for that. And so that was a big reframing, because I thought, oh, you don't need to feel guilty about that. Your mother wouldn't have done that because of anything you did as a child. That's ridiculous. So that was a major reframing for me, and it came very organically with having my own children.
Now, in hindsight, I'm guessing that was by having your own children, just now learning when you had your children. We're talking about a 30-year or so journey to learn to process and cope with yourself, maybe to regain a life purpose. I'm searching for the right words.
Yeah, I mean, after my mom passed away, those many years leading up to my divorce up to my marriage, having children and divorce, they were rough and tumble, because again, I didn't go to therapy. So I was figuring it out on my own, not realizing that I had anything to figure out. And there was a lot of good in there. I had a great job. I worked hard. I knew that I needed to do those kinds of things to earn a living, which was very important to me. So it was more of an unconscious decision to get there and unpack it all.
Now, you chronicled all of this in a book you wrote, I believe. And Mary, can you talk to us about the book title and what inspired you to write the book and what your ultimate goal was in writing?
Sure. So the book is called Home: My Story of House and Personal Restoration. It's a memoir, which means, for people who may not be familiar with memoirs cover a certain segment of a person's life. What inspired me to write this book was I had been living in a house that I purchased as a single mom. And I think it was around 2004 when I purchased this house. It had loads of charm and character. It was built in 1923. And I knew that it was very unusual. It had a gambrel roof, but it had this little concentrical room at the front. It was very sweet. And I fell absolutely in love with it, even though it was a bit run down. It needs some work. So I moved into that house with my children, and I'd been living there for a year when a strange car pulled up the driveway. And this woman looked at me and she said, "I'm Pauline Bailey. And I'm 88 years old. And when I was a little girl, I used to live here." And then her daughter leaned over. Her daughter had been driving, and she said, "Yeah, my mom's hoping to see inside the house again." So I was so thrilled to see them and bring them in. I felt like a part of my house came back to me from the past to speak to me. So that day, Pauline Bailey gave me a tour of my own home. And that's what inspired me to start writing about the house, because she pointed out all kinds of interesting things, like the hidey hole in the floor where her father hid $50 bills, and the cabinet that he created, and the flagpole that he put up when her brothers went to World War II, and the window they used to hang out to smoke cigarettes, and the way they took care of the wooden floors. And you're wondering about this time, Ron and Marty, you're probably wondering, what does this have to do with her life? So I had been a journalist, a newspaper reporter, and I'd left that job for a better opportunity in corporate America, but I was very much missing my journalist job. And I wanted to preserve all that Pauline had shared with me. So I just started to create this little book. It was going to originally be just about this house. But as I started to reflect more on what home meant to me, all of my past emerged too. So it ended up being a bit about the house I grew up in, and this house now that was really helping me to become a better person by repairing it.
No, that is a great story of recounting life, the memories of it, and yes, as you use the expression, reframing your mind. Mary, as you wrote your book and the memoirs and you were thinking back to the way things were, I'm going to ask you a question that we may not be able to answer just because, but I'm thinking of Well, it occurred just a little over a year ago. A distant relative, not biological, hanged herself. And I'm always thinking, is there anything maybe we could have done to intervene, to look for the signs, to engage with that person to maybe help them over whatever it is that caused them to even think what they were thinking? Because the person I'm thinking of, it was the third attempt. And I just, Mary, it may be a very unfair question. I don't know that there is an answer to this, but if there were a way to encourage our listeners to engage based on just general awareness, let's engage in people's lives so they do not make a fateful decision.
Yes, absolutely. There absolutely are things that can be done. And, in the back of my book, so my book it's really like reading a story, like a novel. But in the back, I have a bibliography in the back because I sort of, as being both a journalist and a medical writer, I'm a bit of a nerd as well. And so I wanted to make sure that everything was very factual and accurate. There's also an epilogue where I talk about what people can do. If you know someone having a rough time, talk to them in private. Listen to their story. And I think that listening is so important. Tell them you care and ask them if they're thinking about suicide. You should really ask that question and encourage them to seek treatment or to contact their doctor or therapist. Don't debate over the value of life or minimizing their problems. We need to validate that people are experiencing what they're experiencing, no matter how minor they may seem or trivial, because the way that someone else is perceiving what's happening to them is big, even though to us, we can see that other side, especially with young people. You see a young person go through a breakup and it's the end of the world. And to you, we've been through so much in life by now. We look at that and say, you're going to have a lot of people in your life, but they can't see it. So we need to acknowledge that. And if you feel that someone is absolutely thinking about, committing suicide, we need to take them really seriously. If you really think that's where they're at, we should stay with them and call emergency help. And that might seem, like a big move, like, oh my goodness, the police are going to come to the door with flashing lights and all of that, but it's worth it, right? If you really believe somebody is going to do that. Try to get any lethal things out of the house that, you think they might have, like pills or cords. I know it's hard to do that, but as much as possible. Tell them that they can text TALK to 741-741 to text and talk with a trained counselor. If you really need to do this, you can escort them to mental health services or to the emergency room. But the one thing I say is, I've read a lot about suicide through reading this book. There's research to show that people who are contemplating suicide or who try and are unsuccessful are really glad they were. They're glad they didn't go through with it. If there is somebody out there who's thinking about suicide, seek help from an emergency room or mental health services right away. Just believe me when I say that you will be missed more and for longer than you could ever imagine in this moment.
Mary, I think there's some of our listeners who feel they are not qualified, not certified, whatever. And I am not. For those who are certified in suicide prevention, therapists, and so forth, I'm not minimizing any of their training. But I'm saying what I'm about to say to encourage people to engage. You do not need a specific shingle on the wall to just express dialogue with a person that indicates you care. And it's very possible that conversation may keep a person from making a fateful decision. I'm going to ask you, Mary, based on your research, this book, if you would consider another episode where we talk about mental health. Marty and I are emphasizing mental health. I am retired military, but I know statistically a military person will commit suicide every 22 minutes. There's something this person is thinking about that makes them think life is no longer worth living the way I'm living, I just choose to believe if we engage with that person, are you okay? Many of us, I'm speaking myself as well, will not volunteer anything. You'll have to, I say, earn the right to be the safe person to ask me. And if I feel it's safe, I'll discuss with you. But Mary, that's kind of a long explanation of asking you if you would consider addressing this topic a little bit more of mental health, because I think there are a lot of people who don't feel qualified to engage. And I think we just need to learn to engage. Yes, some people may need more trained help than what we can provide, but at least let's do something, lean forward and start a conversation.
Sure. I mean, I absolutely would talk with you more, but just, to set that record straight. I'm not a therapist and I'm not a specialist in this area or a medical specialist or anything, but I think as just lay people, there's a lot we can all do, right? There's a lot we can do, and we may feel powerless, but I think just listening to people is really gets a long way with them. And if you have a friend who's down and out, or family member who's really, really having a rough time, a kid, I mean, think about what the kids go through too, and the suicide rates among kids. Listening, just sitting and listening to them in an active way, just letting them pour everything out, that is so cleansing for a person. And I think we can be there in those ways, and then try to direct them to the help they need when it's necessary. 988 is the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. And anybody can call them 24 hours a day, and somebody will talk with them and help them.
Barry, you mentioned you're not specifically certified, but I will say on your behalf, you have life experience, and that's extremely valuable. That evaluated life experience is a lot of what we're about. And we want to encourage others to lean forward, I call it. Let's engage, and let's not minimize the very positive impact we can and will have on another person's life. Mary, on behalf of our listeners, I want to sincerely thank you for your life, your book. Let's continue your journey through another episode. Our listeners can gain a lot from your life experience.
Thank you so much, both Ron and Marty. And I just want to mention, if anybody is interested, my website is mgbarlow.com, and you can get a connection to the book and more information.
And Mary, we're going to make that available to all of our listeners through a narrative that accompanies this podcast. Thank you so much for every bit of your research, your writing, and your life experience.
Thank you so much for having me, Ron and Marty. I appreciate it. It's been a pleasure to speak with you.
Thank you. This has been great. We appreciate having the opportunity to share our and our guests' life experiences with you.
The Cooper Culture advances organizations to achieve and sustain high retention rates, connected communication, and trust through personality insights and principled leadership. You can contact us at our website, thecooperculture.com, and you can contact us directly at ron@thecooperculture.com or Marty, M-A-R-T-Y, at thecooperculture.com. We work with you to help assess aspects of your culture to advance the environment and people to their best performance. We do that through our staff of certified personal performance coaches, leadership trainers, keynote speakers, and DISC personality behavior experts. You can book a speaking engagement directly through our website by contacting us at ron@thecooperculture.com. We look forward to sharing our life experiences with you, some of which are profound, some of which are pretty funny. Some of those life experiences are ones we'll never do that again because we've been through stuff. We truly look forward to working with you, speaking with you, helping advance you in any way that we can.